In today's lesson, we're going to explore the components of blood. And the learning objective today is just one objective. It's to explore the different components of blood. Now, there are a number of components that we need to look at, and we need to go into a bit of detail. So I have left it at one learning objective here. So can you put the title, Components of Blood? We're moving away from digestion here now. And we're going to start looking at the different types of cells, and then we're going to work our way up to the circulatory system, and we're going to look at the structure of the heart as well. So for now, we're just going to look at what makes up blood. So before we start, I just want to do a quick quiz here, and as I play the video, I'm going to ask you to identify certain cells. Now, we have come across some of these cells, and also I'm going to ask you to identify certain cellular components or cellular organelles. So we'll play the video, and what I want you to do is note down the cells I ask you or cellular components I ask you to identify and type them back to me on Teams. Okay, so let's see. Can you identify the cells that are flowing here in this blood vessel? So can you identify at least one of the cells that are flowing in this blood vessel on the left-hand side of the screen? And can you number that question 1 when you type it back on Teams? Don't worry about these cells. We'll come across these cells a bit later. Now this cell here, look carefully at the structure of this cell. Look carefully what's going on, and can you identify this cell? So this is question 2. So identify this cell. Question 2, identify this cell. We've come back to the blood vessel. And can you identify one of the cells that were just shown there? So if I go back, can you identify one of the cells shown here? So this is question 3. And can you identify for question 4 what you are just seeing here? So what are you seeing here? What is this structure that you're seeing? So can you identify that structure, and can you type your answer back on Teams? This structure here, what are you seeing? Now, we are dealing with multicellular organisms. For example, we are multicellular organisms. And this unit, as I said, it builds up into a larger unit that we'll come across later. So what we're going to look at is how we build up the contents of today's lesson and how it will eventually lead into a larger unit. So the whole of the entire unit can be summed up as consisting of the circulatory system, the human circulatory system. So what we are learning is all part of this system here. The human circulatory system. Now, this system is made up of, so let's just put an arrow down. This system, we can say, is made up of blood, blood vessels, and the heart. Now there is more to it, but if we were to look at the content which we are going to cover, we can, in essence, break it up into these three sections. We will actually break it up even further, but essentially each of the topics, subtopics we're going to cover now will follow into this pattern, and we'll have to link it up to the human circulatory system. So can you just take down this here into your notes so you understand in terms of as we cover new theory, you understand where we're actually going with this. So our end point is the human circulatory system, to understand the workings of this system here. Our blood can be divided into 4 categories or 4 components that make up blood, and one particular category can be further subdivided, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the 3 main components I'm going to state first, and then I'll come on to the 4th component. So the first one we say is our red blood cells. So the first component is red blood cell or red blood cells. Okay. Next, we have white blood cells. And then finally, we have something known as platelets. So I'm just going to do it in a slightly different color. So I'll just say, do it in this color. Yeah, that's fine. And platelets. Okay, so you should be able to see that on the word platelets there to your far right. Okay, so you have red blood cells, white blood cells, and then you have platelets. Now, these make up these components make up blood. However, all of these components are floating in a liquid known as plasma. So all of these 3 components are floating in something known as plasma. So, and this plasma is a yellow liquid. So all of these 3 substances, these 3 components, are transported in a medium known as, instead of saying blood plasma, we'll just call it plasma for now. Okay, so this is our 4th component. So blood is considered, because of this, because you've got here 4 different components, it's considered a tissue. Because you've got red blood cells, you've got white blood cells, you've got platelets, and then you've got plasma, which is transporting all of these components. And plasma itself can be further broken down and categorized. Plasma is mostly water with a variety of other substances that are dissolved in the plasma, in the water. And these substances include glucose, which is a nutrient, and, for example, another type of substance would be urea, which is a waste product. So plasma itself is carrying other substances in addition to the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And it's a yellow-colored liquid. And for this reason, blood is considered a tissue. So can you just write that down? That for this reason, you should be able to understand why we call blood a tissue now, based on the description of the components, a very quick description of the components. So can you write down to the side, blood is considered to be a tissue. Okay, so do not get confused and say blood is just a cell, or you associate it with red blood cells, or you associate it with just white blood cells. So you just say blood is to do with cells. No, it's a tissue because it's made up of a variety of substances here, a variety of cells. So now I'm going to just give you a few key points about blood plasma, about the plasma we spoke about just a few moments ago, which was the fourth component, which carries all the other components. So can we write that plasma, so our first point, plasma is a liquid plasma is a liquid that is mostly made of water. Now, this means that substances can be dissolved into the plasma, into the blood plasma, because water is a solvent. It has ability to allow different types of substances to dissolve into it. And this liquid is not entirely water, it's mostly water, and it's a yellowish liquid. So could you just put in your notes that it is a yellowish liquid? So we've stated that it's mostly water, and it carries, I'm going to abbreviate red blood cells as RBC, okay, and white blood cells as WBC. And if you're not sure what that means, can you put that to the side in your notes? So RBC from now on stands for red blood cells, and WBC stands for white blood cells. So it carries RBC, white blood cells, and platelets. Okay, it carries red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, which are suspended in the plasma. Next point is that blood plasma carries many dissolved substances around the body. So carries many dissolved substances around the body. Now this is possible because of the water content of the plasma. The dissolved substances in blood plasma can be seen as three main components that you will need to remember. The first one we say is waste carbon dioxide, waste CO2, okay, which is produced by the respiring cells, and waste CO2 is produced by the cells, and this has to be carried in the blood plasma back to the lungs. Okay, so the waste CO2 has to be carried back to the lungs, which what the carbon dioxide was produced by the respiring cells. The next substance that is carried in the plasma is urea, and this is formed in the liver and happens when excess proteins are broken down. And this is carried to the kidneys, so the urea that is formed is carried to the kidneys and is removed from the blood in the form of urine. So urea produced in the liver must be removed from the blood. Urea is toxic, so it needs to be removed from the blood, and it's a waste product and it needs to be removed, and it's produced in the liver and must be removed. It is produced from excess proteins which are broken down in the liver. So can you put that into your notes as well? Can you say that urea is produced when excess proteins are broken down by the liver, and this urea is transported in the blood to the kidneys and removed as urine as a waste product from your body. Okay, next point. Can you just say small soluble products of digestion pass into the plasma from your small intestine and are transported to the individual cells? So small products of digestion. Now we looked at digestion in the previous lesson, and the products that were produced by the breakdown of mechanical and enzyme action, these small products of digestion pass into the plasma. The microvilli where the nutrients were being absorbed had a larger blood supply. So all these nutrients are passing into the blood and are carried in the blood plasma. So small products of digestion pass into the plasma, from the small intestine. Okay, so, and once we've absorbed the small products from the small intestine, they are transported to the cells which need those nutrients. So small products of digestion pass into the plasma from the small intestine, and then these small products are taken to the individual cells in the body that require these nutrients. So this is a quick overview of blood plasma. And here you can see, I'm just going to show you here, is the composition of blood plasma to the red blood cells and white blood cells. Here you can see whole blood on the right, and after a process of centrifugation, we separate out the components of blood. And what I want you to notice is the percentages of each component for plasma, for the white blood cells, and for the red blood cells. And this is another name for red blood cells, so just be aware that's another name for the red blood cells, but you don't have to remember it in that way. You can just refer it to as red blood cells. But I want you to take down the percentages for each component for blood. And can you just put that to a side? You do not have to draw the diagrams, but the percentages would be helpful. Here you can see a bit more detail about the components of the blood. So we've got blood plasma, approximately 55%, white blood cells and platelets, approximately 1%, and red blood cells, approximately 45%. Here you can see red blood cells, here you can see the plasma and the red blood cells separated out in a real image. So previously we were looking at just a diagram of plasma, white blood cells and red blood cells here and how it's separated out after centrifugation, and here we can see an actual image of this. So this is the actual color of blood plasma, and you can see the color of the red blood cells once it's been separated from the blood plasma itself. Here you can see a packet of blood plasma. So once we've separated the blood plasma from the red blood cells, you can see here how they actually collect blood plasma and use it when needed. And this is how it actually appears when it's collected. And this is a real image as well of blood plasma. In this clip, I'm going to show you how the blood plasma is transporting the components of blood around the body. So as we can see, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are being transported around the body in the blood vessels. Here in the small intestine, the products of digestion are absorbed into the blood plasma, and you would essentially get, so if you just go back a bit here, these are products of digestion that have come into blood plasma. They would include glucose, vitamins, minerals, and other dissolved substances. And what you're seeing here is that when blood plasma goes to the kidneys, here, because of the urea produced in the liver, which we talked about earlier, the urea is removed from the blood plasma at the kidneys here. And it is removed and from the body and excreted as waste. And it happens here. And this is where urea is being removed. So here you can see a scanning electron microscope image of blood plasma and the components suspended in the blood plasma. So just take a note of the components here that you're seeing and how they look in actuality. So this is a scanning electron microscope image that is being shown here of white blood cells, platelets, and red blood cells, and the plasma in which they're all suspended in. So now we're going to look at red blood cells, the component that is found in blood plasma. So we're going to take a few points down about red blood cells, and then we're going to look at the structure in a bit more detail. The first point is that there are approximately 5 million in each cubic millimeter of blood. So about 5 million RBCs, red blood cells, in each cubic milliliter of blood. Millimeter of blood. So in a cubic millimeter, you have approximately 5 million red blood cells. That's quite a lot when you think about it. And there are more red blood cells than any other type of blood cell in the body. Now, the red blood cells are going to take up oxygen from the air in your lungs and then carry it to the cells where respiration is occurring. So the cells that are respiring, they are going to take the oxygen which was picked up in the lungs and deliver it to those respiring cells. And so let's put a note here about what the function is of red blood cells. So can we just quickly note down that the red blood cells need to pick up oxygen at the lungs and carry it to cells that require it. So red blood cells pick up oxygen at the lungs and carry it to cells that need it. And these cells are respiring cells. Now, the cells that pick up oxygen from the red blood cells invariably will also give out waste products that also need to be removed. And can you tell me one waste product that respiring cells will produce? And can you type your answer back to me on Teams? So just pause the video here and can you type back to me one waste product that respiring cells will produce that has to be taken back to the lungs? Alright, now we're going to look at how red blood cells are adapted to make them efficient at their job of carrying oxygen to respiring cells. The first point is that they have a biconcave shape. So they have a biconcave shape. Biconcave shape, and this means that it provides a larger surface area to volume ratio for the gases to diffuse in and out of the red blood cell. So a biconcave shape gives an increased surface area to volume ratio. Okay, for gases to diffuse in and out. So this specialized biconcave shape, which is disc shaped, gives a greater surface area to volume ratio for gases to diffuse in and out. So let's look at this biconcave shape. You can see an image of the red blood cells. You can see a diagram of a red blood cell and an actual scanning electron microscope image of a red blood cell. Notice the indentation at the center of the red blood cell. And if we look at the red blood cell side on, if you look here, if you look at this image here, you can see where this biconcave shape, the name biconcave, how it comes about. Now all of this allows for oxygen to quickly diffuse in and out of the red blood cell at a very fast rate. So let's just say a few things about the red blood cell by looking at its shape, how it's adapted to perform its function. So it is very small. You can see here a size value has been given for the RBC, so very small. This allows it to go through capillaries and get to respiring cells. They are packed with hemoglobin. They are packed with, it's a red pigment. Red pigment called hemoglobin. Okay, and the hemoglobin is what is going to bind to the oxygen. And they have no nucleus. Now you should remember this from our previous lessons where we looked at cells and specialized cells. So this should not be new to you, and that's why I'm briefly going over this, because we did look at white blood cells and red blood cells in detail in a previous unit where we looked at specialized cells. So very small, they are packed with a red pigment called hemoglobin, which allows for the oxygen to bind to the red blood cell, and also they have no nucleus, okay, allowing more space for the hemoglobin. So have no nucleus, allowing more space for hemoglobin. Okay, so could you just take down these notes just for the red blood cell? Note the shape and remember that it increases the surface area to volume ratio for diffusion to occur. So just to summarize what's happening with the red blood cells, the red blood cells are picking up oxygen at the lungs, and the red blood cells contain hemoglobin. So what we say is that hemoglobin and oxygen are separate here. So just before it picks it up, the hemoglobin in the red blood cells and the oxygen have not combined yet. But when they do combine, okay, we get oxyhemoglobin. Okay, so we get this compound here. We get this combined oxygen and hemoglobin here. And then once this oxyhemoglobin, which is in the red blood cell, moves through the body in the blood plasma, reaches the respiring tissues or respiring cells. In this case, it's a muscle tissue, and we've got muscle cells that require oxygen. The oxygen comes out of the red blood cell, diffuses out of the red blood cell, and now it's no longer bound. So we get here oxygen plus hemoglobin. Okay, so just be aware of this word. Oxyhemoglobin forms in the red blood cells when the oxygen binds with hemoglobin in the cell, in the red blood cell. And then it's transported in the blood plasma to the respiring tissues, where the oxygen will diffuse out of the red blood cells to the cells that need it. Here we're going to look at how the red blood cells are transported around the body and how it's actually interacting with oxygen and hemoglobin, how the hemoglobin and oxygen are interacting and how that is being transported around the body. So what I want you to note is that the oxygen is being picked up by the red blood cells at the lungs, and then notice how it gets transported around around the body via the blood vessels, And notice how the blood vessels narrow as we get closer to the respiring tissues that need the oxygen. So here we're looking at the heart and lungs, and specifically our focus is at the lungs. And we're looking at the red blood cells flowing along in blood plasma. Here you can see the oxygen binding to the hemoglobin, and the red blood cells are off now, going through the body, and here they are at the respiring tissues and releasing the oxygen to those respiring tissues that need it. And notice now the waste products of carbon dioxide are dissolving into the blood plasma and some into the red blood cells, and now are transported back towards the lungs where they will release the waste. Here we're going to look at how red blood cells are produced and where they're produced. You don't need to know this in detail for your exam, but it's something that's good to know in terms of where we're getting these red blood cells from. So as I play the video, you're going to see the site of production where the red blood cells are produced. In addition, just notice again how the components of blood are flowing in the blood plasma in these blood vessels. So you can see here red blood cells flowing with white blood cells and platelets and other dissolved substances in blood plasma. Now, the red blood cells are produced from the bones, from certain parts of the skeletal system that are identified here. So if I just go back again, you can see those regions that are in blue, that are the sites of where the red blood cell production happens the most. Okay, so I'll go again. You can see the site at which where red blood cell production happens the most, these regions in blue. So the red blood cells are produced from the bones. So if I continue this, so now we'll go deep into some certain part of the bone, and you can see these types of cells are responsible within the bone for producing the red blood cells. And you can see here that a red blood cell matures, and once it's mature, this is a mature red blood cell, it is transported out. Now we'll move on to white blood cells. White blood cells, from our earlier topics, we know that white blood cells are larger in size in comparison to red blood cells, and there's not as much of them in terms of number when we compare them to red blood cells. And they also have a nucleus which forms part of the immune system response. Here you can see a typical diagram of a white blood cell. So this image here shows various types of white blood cells, and you can notice that there is a significant difference in terms of the structure of white blood cells with their nucleus. They're quite large, and although they vary in size, the nucleus in comparison to the rest of the cell is quite large. This is because of their involvement in the immune response, and they are needed to recognize different types of pathogens. So some white blood cells, for example lymphocytes, that you can see represented here, form antibodies against microorganisms. Other white blood cells will form antitoxins against poisons that are made by certain pathogens. And then there are other types of white blood cells known as phagocytes that will engulf and break down by digesting invading bacteria and viruses. So you don't have to take down all of the names of these different types of white blood cells. Take down lymphocytes, and can you just put that lymphocytes are involved in producing antibodies against microorganisms or pathogens. So here are some key points that I want you to take down for white blood cells. Larger than red blood cells. They have a larger nucleus. Which is also quite large, and this nucleus is important for the body's defense system to help with immunity. So we can say part of the body's defense system. And this is because we're going to come on to this later when we talk about how pathogens are neutralized within the body. But the body's defense system is to act against harmful microorganisms. And so various white blood cells will have various roles, as we looked at just a few moments ago. So some white blood cells, such as lymphocytes, so let's put a few notes down for the blood cells here, white blood cells here. Lymphocytes will form antibodies, will produce antibodies against pathogens. A pathogen is any disease-causing microorganism. Then we have other types will form antitoxins. Others form antitoxins. And others perform a process known as phagocytosis, which is engulfing and digesting bacteria and viruses. And then while some engulf, so this is phagocytosis. So when the bacterial virus is engulfed, it's known as phagocytosis. So these types of white blood cells are called phagocytes. Okay, so some engulf, and these white blood cells are known as phagocytes. They engulf and digest pathogens. So this is just a quick breakdown of the white blood cells. And as I said, we've covered this in detail previously in terms of just the overall structure of white blood cells. And what we will do is that we will go on to immunity and microorganisms that cause disease, such as the different types of pathogens later on. Now I'm going to show you a short clip where we are looking at the different types of immune response via the white blood cells, how white blood cells are working. So we're just going to look at one of the processes by which white blood cells can work, and we're going to look at phagocytosis, and this is carried out by white blood cells known as phagocytes. So as I play the video, I just want you to notice how the mechanism by which that these white blood cells will neutralize these particular pathogens. So just in case some of you have not, let's say, identified the white blood cell and the pathogen is the microorganism in green, and the white blood cell is the one in the irregular white shaped structure with the nucleus. So we see this pathogen and we can see it's much smaller than the white blood cell, and it is going to be recognized by the white blood cell due to certain proteins on the surface of the pathogen. Once it's recognized, the white blood cell will engulf the pathogen by phagocytosis, and then certain enzymes start digesting and breaking down the pathogen, and then it is finally expelled from the white blood cell. So if we just look at that again, we can see that the pathogen, due to certain proteins on its surface, is recognized. So due to certain chemicals on the surface of the pathogen, is recognized by the specific white blood cell, the phagocyte. This causes the phagocyte to engulf the pathogen and forms a vacuole by which it is enclosed inside the white blood cell. Then lysosomes will come along and start to release certain enzymes and certain chemicals that are going to start to break down the actual pathogen, and then the broken down pathogen, the harmless products, waste products, are released out of the white blood cell. So this is how one type of white blood cell is performing its function. So the final component of blood we're going to look at today are the platelets. So platelets are small fragments of cells, and just like red blood cells, platelets do not have a nucleus. However, they're not transporting substances to respiring cells. Instead, platelets are important to help in clotting blood at the site of a wound. So can we just put a few points down? So the first point is that platelets are fragments of cells. So fragments of cells, and they're quite small in size. You may have noticed that they are irregular shaped as well. So they're fragments of cells, and they have no nucleus. Okay, so platelets do not have a nucleus. They are important, so their role is in blood clotting. So role is to clot blood at the site of a wound. So this is actually a very important role, because if your blood was not to clot at a site of a wound, you could very easily bleed to death. And there are certain conditions, medical conditions, where people have trouble with their blood not clotting properly, and this is because they do not have platelets in sufficient numbers, or there's a problem with the platelets, so they are not able to clot a wound successfully, and they're always in danger of either bleeding to death, or you can also catch infections if your wounds are not properly sealed, because in addition to sealing the wound, i.e. preventing further blood loss, platelets also protect the skin as it grows and stops bacteria entering the body through the wound. So the role of platelets is to clot at the site of a wound. This prevents further blood loss this prevents further blood loss and, we'll say and, prevents bacteria entering or any pathogens entering, bacteria entering the wound. So the way that platelets are able to do this, there is a mechanism involved, and we have to actually sort of, for your exam, you will have to know how these platelets are able to clot a wound, or let's say a damage to the body where blood is exposed. And this occurs because blood clotting is a series of enzyme controlled reactions that result in the clot forming. And I'm going to outline how this comes about in just a few sentences, and I want you to note it down, but I want you to box it off so it's clear. So can you just write this down, and can you make sure that you highlight this or you put it in a box so it's visible to you when you come to revise. Blood clotting is a series of enzyme controlled reactions. Okay, that's the first point. And these reactions essentially convert, okay, let's put it as enzyme control reactions converting fibrinogen into fibrin. Now, why this is important is because once we get this fibrin, it traps other platelets and other red blood cells together, and it produces a network of proteins. The fibrin produces a network of proteins that capture other red blood cells and more platelets to form a clot that stops further blood loss. So the fibrin, so can we put down fibrin is a network of proteins that capture more RBCs and platelets to form a clot. And this clot will prevent further blood loss and prevent pathogens entering the body through the wound. So what you're going to see now is the action of platelets in responding to a wound. You're going to see how they rush towards the site where there has been a wound detected, but notice at the same time that platelets are not produced at the site of where the wound is occurred. Platelets are flowing, remember, in the plasma. They're suspended in the plasma and flow along with the other components of blood. And how through a series of enzyme control reactions, blood clotting is brought about, and you will see fibrinogen turning into fibrin, this network which gathers more red blood cells and platelets to form a blood clot, which will eventually harden to form a scab. See, the platelets are attaching to the site of the wound, and the chemical enzyme controlled reactions take place. Fibrinogen is converted into fibrin, and you will see a network of proteins begin to form, and this will gather more red blood cells and form a scab and close the wound. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to take a broader overview of how platelets are involved in closing a wound. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play this video clip in full, and I'm going to talk at certain points, but then we'll go back and look at certain points in more detail. So as I play the video, notice the various other types of cells that are involved in wound healing and also closing the wound itself. So we have the site of the wound here, and you can see that blood is being lost. So platelets are forming around the wound with blood and closing the wound off. And then we have histamine being released, causing inflammation and more blood cells and platelets to come to the site of the wound. But we also have white blood cells playing a role in removing any bacteria and dead tissue matter. And then this allows for collagen to form and the wound eventually heals.